Okay, and welcome astute researchers, video 10 here for you. Today, what we're going to do briefly is get into chapter 4. I'm going to give you a basic review of study designs. We're going to talk about internal validity, and that should say external validity. Internal validity, and pretend that says external validity. Okay, so basic study designs. Some of these you're very familiar with at this point. Some of them are still a little new. A case study, you're just looking at one person, one case. Case study, one person. It's helpful sometimes to go in depth. Sometimes it can help you with understanding a little bit better. But the weakness of a case study is that it's one person, and so it's hard to apply it across the board because that one person is always unique. All right, looking at a frequency study, you might remember this has just one variable. And so you're describing with looking at a frequency study, you're describing what's going on. You can't make any other connections though, because all you can do is describe. You've only collected one variable. The association studies are also called correlational studies. When you correlate two variables, you're looking at how they relate to each other. Do they both go up at the same time? Does one go up and one go down? But what doesn't happen is in a correlation, one of them stays the same and one of them changes. So then you don't have a correlation. A correlation means there's a relationship, so that you're looking for that relationship, or in other words, that association. And so here you always have at least two variables. In an experiment, you're trying to identify anything causal. Does this cause that? Causality. And so with an experiment, you're manipulating one of the variables. We call that the independent variable. And you're holding the other variables constant so that you can see the effect of the independent variable on your dependent variable, hopefully without the other variables interfering. We'll talk a little bit more about that next video. And then you have a quasi-experiment. The difference between an experiment and a quasi-experiment is that the quasi-experiments aren't able to have random assignment. Usually they're, like we talked about last week, there are things like lung cancer or something that have quasi-experiments because you can't assign somebody to get lung cancer. That was in lab 14. So quasi-experiments, no random assignment. Experiments, yes, random assignment. And what we mean by random assignment is the people are randomly assigned to which group that they are in. Are you in the treatment group A or treatment group B or treatment group C? Are you in the treatment group or the control group? Whatever it is, you are assigned by random. Usually when people assign you randomly, they use either a random number table that you can find online or in a book, or they ask the computer to randomly assign you, and there are easy computer programs to do that. I think Excel has a program that you can do that. So the goal here is to better understand variables, better understand phenomena. And so you can either explain phenomena, you can predict, and that use associations to predict, because if you know the relationship between the variables, if you know one of the variables, then you can predict the other, right? Or you can describe, right? And that's just the frequency where you're only able to describe, you can't explain or predict. So in order to make explanations, which are causal in oriented, what you want to look at are how the differences in the variable you're measuring, which is the dependent variable, how do those get explained or attributed? Explained, attributed, same thing, to various causes. Is it like, the person just randomly started doing that, or they're breathing ether and that's why they passed out? So you want to look at, does your independent variable explain the difference in the dependent variable that happens when you apply the independent variable? So for example, you might think about all the variables that affect hunger. Maybe you haven't eaten for a long time. Maybe you don't like to eat. Maybe you have practiced not eating so much that you don't feel hungry. Maybe you just ate an entire chocolate cake and so you're really not hungry. There are lots of reasons why you might be hungry or not hungry. And so if you want to measure hunger, you want to know about those other variables too, so that you can make sure they're not getting in the way of your independent variable in this study. So lots of variables might affect your dependent variable It might be that the reason that you are not hungry is because you ate that cake. That would be one of the variables. Or it might be that you just practice never eating, and so you can't tell if you're hungry. How do you know which one it is that affects the dependent variable? Well, you can manage those. We'll talk about that next next video. You manage them by controlling the other videos as much as you can. And so the reason why you want to control the variables is that so your explanation of what happened is a valid explanation. So if I say, well, whenever I blink at people, they stop being hungry. Okay, well, so blinking is your independent variable and being hungry is your dependent variable. But what if half the people ate a chocolate cake before they walked into the room? Then the reason they're not hungry is not because you blinked at them, it's because they ate chocolate cake. So that would be an extraneous variable, eating chocolate cake. And so you're thinking it's blinking, but you're not accounting for those other variables. And so your blinking explanation is actually not valid. And the chocolate cake explanation would be a threat to your internal validity. So the internal validity of the study is how valid your explanation is. Internal validity explanations are if they have internal validity, then that means it's the best explanation that you know of. So you set up your experiment so that you manage the variables so that the only variables that affect a person are your independent variables and everything else is controlled. So that gives you internal validity. That means that internal to your study, your explanation is the explanation that makes the most sense, or it's the true explanation, because you've managed to make it so that the only people who come to your study are the people who have not had chocolate cake or who have not eaten in the past, I don't know, 6 hours, something like that. Any other explanation, like I ate chocolate cake or etc., are threats. They're considered threats to internal validity. And so what you want to do is anticipate those other explanations. So think about things. Think about what else might be an explanation for my results. And then control that so you can rule those out. And that way you can tell it was your independent variable, like you're blinking, for example, or they got the treatment drug or whatever that made a difference, not some other variable. External validity, on the other hand, is this idea that how valid to the outside is your study. In other words, how well do your results apply to other populations, to the broader population? If you do a study on 3 people, then it's going to have low external validity because it's only 3 people, and those 3 people might be fairly unique. If your study is over like 20 or 30,000 people, then you're probably representing most of the population with those 20 or 30,000 people, or at least some significant segment of the population. And so external validity is about to what extent do your results apply. So to sum up, what you want to do is describe, predict, or explain variables. That's what we're doing in science. When you describe them, you're doing a frequency study. When you're explaining them, you're doing a causal study. When you predict, you're doing an association study. Internal validity is whether or not your explanation for what happened is the best explanation, and what are the other variables that might have interfered and also caused your result to happen. If you can eliminate all those, then you have more internal validity in your study. External validity, that was a typo. External validity is about, are your explanations valid beyond the actual sample that you used? And to what extent can we apply your explanation to the broader population? That's external validity. That's it for this video.